No one in the courtroom expected a man who could not hear a single word to change the course of a high-stakes trial that day. In the hushed tension of the wood-paneled chamber, the stale smell of old books and echo of footsteps on polished floors was familiar to every regular, lawyers, bailiffs, the judge presiding on his bench. But something about Michael Henderson's presence signaled the start of an extraordinary event. Maybe it was a determined way he clutched the thick folder of papers, his shoulders squared with the careful intention of a man prepared to confront a lifetime of prejudice. Or perhaps it was a vulnerability in his eyes, a flickering recognition of the invisible barriers he had battled for years. People often say you can sense monumental change in the air, like the metallic tang before a summer thunderstorm. On that day, in that quiet moment before the trial resumed, you could almost taste it. Michael was deaf from birth, a reality that had shaped him in ways most people could never understand. His parents, both artists, had taught him the beauty of the world through shapes, colors, and tactile experiences. By the age of 5, he could paint a sunrise so vibrant it seemed to light up the room. But beneath his extraordinary gift, he also harbored the scars of being marginalized in a society that rarely accommodated his needs. He had encountered countless teachers who believed being deaf equaled being incapable. He had endured the sideways looks from strangers when he dared to step into places where deaf people were rarely seen or acknowledged, like the local union meeting or the city council session. Yet he persisted, propelled by an unshakable sense of self-worth and a well-honed resilience. Those who truly knew Michael would say that when he set his mind on something, he became unstoppable, a quiet force of nature. He had grown up in a loving household, but had quickly realized that the world beyond home's warm glow was often unkind. There were humiliations in school, like teachers who repeatedly forgot to have a sign language interpreter in class, or the times he was left out of group activities because he couldn't hear the instructions. As he grew older, the humiliations became more insidious. Job interviews that ended abruptly once employers discovered his deafness, social gatherings where people simply couldn't be bothered to communicate with him. Still, Michael persevered, discovering along the way that adversity carved a deeper well of strength in him. And so, while many people might have shrunk under consistent rejection, Michael rose above it, fueled by a quiet storm of determination. Years later, he found himself at the center of a legal dispute that threatened his small business. Michael owned a modest print shop in the heart of the city. It was an unassuming storefront nestled between a vintage bookstore and a busy cafe, but his work was so meticulous and inspired that local artists, businesses, and even nonprofits sought him out. He specialized in custom printing projects, large murals, art prints on textured paper, fine business stationery. His deafness mattered little to his clientele. What mattered was his attention to detail, his unwavering commitment to perfection, and the radiant positivity he brought to every job. But such success also attracted envy. When a rival print shop, run by a man named Mark Cosgrove, started losing clients to Michael's store, resentment grew into a festering grudge. Rumors circulated that Cosgrove had political connections, enough, perhaps, to tilt the scales of justice in his favor if ever a conflict arose. And sure enough, conflict came. Cosgrove accused Michael of using proprietary techniques stolen from his own shop. The claim was outrageous. Michael had learned his trade through community workshops, online classes with specialized captions, and old textbooks. But Cosgrove pressed on. Soon, Michael found himself served with a cease and desist order, followed by a legal summons accusing him of theft, intellectual property violations, and breach of contract. The lawsuit threatened to shut down Michael's business indefinitely, overshadowing years of hard work and perseverance. The betrayal stung deeply, not just because it risked his livelihood, but because it represented yet another instance of someone using ignorance and prejudice against him. Michael felt certain Cosgrove was banking on one thing, that the deaf man wouldn't have the resources, the intelligence, or the social clout to fight back. However, Michael was not alone. Over the years, he had quietly built a community of supporters, patrons, fellow artists, and advocates who admired his grit. He also had a longtime friend named Rebecca, a paralegal who understood that Michael's case was much bigger than a mere dispute over printing techniques. It was a testament to how often people with disabilities are exploited or underestimated. She introduced him to a young lawyer, hoping to find some affordable representation that would stand a chance against Cosgrove's well-funded legal team. But as the case progressed, it became clear the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. Seemingly trivial motions were ruled against Michael. Court dates were set at times that made it nearly impossible for his sign language interpreter to attend. There were subtle and sometimes overt barriers that seemed designed to frustrate him. The judge assigned to the case, Judge Arnold Caldwell, repeatedly dismissed Michael's request for additional accommodations in open court, as though Michael's deafness was an inconvenience rather than a legitimate disability protected by law. Judge Caldwell was a man of imposing stature and precise mannerisms. He had a clipped way of speaking, an air of impatience, and a sneer that conveyed a sense of superiority whenever he addressed the courtroom. His thinning gray hair was slicked back, giving him a perpetual scowl that made it seem as though he had little tolerance for anything but blind adherence to his authority. He seemed outright annoyed at having to deal with Michael's situation. Often, during pre-trial hearings, the judge would roll his eyes when the interpreter requested a moment to translate. He would glance at his watch or tap his pen on the bench, exuding the clear message that the deaf man was wasting his precious time. These slights accumulated, each tiny moment adding to the slow-burning fire in Michael's chest. Still, he refused to be intimidated. Rebecca urged him to find a lawyer who specialized in disability law. Determined to stand his ground, Michael sent out letters and emails to numerous legal advocacy groups, detailing his predicament. Days turned into weeks, and just when he was on the verge of resignation, he received a response from an unexpected source. The state attorney general's office had become aware of his case, thanks to an internal tip regarding the questionable legal maneuvers by Cosgrove's camp and the suspicious rulings of Judge Caldwell. A letter arrived with the official seal of the attorney general, stating that they were closely examining the situation. Michael was taken aback. The attorney general's office was enormous. Rarely did they intervene in small-scale civil disputes like this. Yet, for reasons not immediately clear, they seemed interested in his case. The letter hinted that Michael's rights as a deaf individual might be systematically violated. Although Michael dared not get his hopes too high, the letter gave him a renewed sense of possibility. When he shared the development with Rebecca, her face lit up a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "The attorney general might step in," she exclaimed, barely able to contain her astonishment. "This could change everything, Michael." The trial proceeded, with preliminary arguments that seemed almost predetermined against Michael. Each time his interpreter tried to clarify a point, Caldwell's impatience would flare. "Let's move this along," the judge would say, before the questions and responses had been properly translated. Documents that Michael produced were routinely dismissed. Even the simplest accommodations, a moment confirmed sign interpretation, were met with visible irritation from Caldwell. Far from the neutral arbiter a judge is meant to be, Caldwell appeared to be taking Cosgrove's side at every turn. And that was before the humiliating incident that became the talk of the entire courthouse. On the third day of what was supposed to be a straightforward trial, Michael was on the stand, using the interpreter. He was explaining how he had developed his unique printing method from public domain sources, not from any trade secrets. The tension in the room was thick as Cosgrove's lawyer, a smug, sharp-tongued man named Leonard White, pressed Michael with pointed questions. Caldwell watched, arms folded, barely hiding his boredom. Then it happened. As Michael signed his response, he hesitated for a moment, tried to recall a specific date. The interpreter asked him to clarify a sign. Before Michael could continue, Caldwell slammed his gavel on the bench. The echo reverberated, a sharp crack of thunder in the hush. Everyone froze. Caldwell glared at Michael. "Can you hear me at all, sir?" he barked, fully aware that Michael was deaf. A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. The question was obviously rhetorical and dripping with mockery. If Caldwell's intention was to humiliate Michael, he succeeded, at least momentarily. A hush fell over the courtroom, so complete that you could hear the rustle of someone's jacket in the back row. Michael felt heat flood his face, not from shame, but from a surge of defiance. He had encountered cruel remarks before, but there was something uniquely degrading about being ridiculed in a venue that was supposed to uphold justice. He locked eyes with Caldwell, Determined not to look away, through his interpreter, Michael simply asked, "Your Honor, may I continue?" The judge pursed his lips, glaring down at Michael as though chastising a child. "Just hurry it up," he snapped. That moment reverberated beyond the courtroom walls. Media outlets picked up snippets of the story, with headlines describing a deaf plaintiff being demeaned by the presiding judge. Disability rights groups began to rally. The notion that such blatant bigotry could be displayed by a judge appalled many. The next day, when court resumed, a quiet swarm of activists and spectators filled the seats. Some wore small badges with a sign language symbol for justice, while others carried notepads ready to document every sliver of injustice that might occur. Yet the real twist was about to unfold, one that no one in that courtroom, especially Judge Caldwell, saw coming. Through an official filing, Michael's defense counsel announced a critical substitution of counsel. He would now be represented by a new lead attorney. When Caldwell read the notice, his usually stoic face twitched in confusion, then disbelief. The name on the filing was not that of a typical private lawyer, but the state's attorney general herself, Elizabeth Ramirez. She was a formidable presence in the state's legal landscape, known for her unwavering commitment to justice and her fiery courtroom manner. Her record of taking on high-profile cases and winning was almost legendary. Rumor had it that if she took a personal interest in a case, she was relentless. The fact that she was stepping into a relatively modest civil lawsuit spoke volumes. Word spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, half the courthouse was buzzing with speculation. Why would the attorney general get personally involved? Did she have a personal tie to Michael? Was there a broader agenda, possibly investigating corruption or judicial misconduct? Or maybe it was a message to the public that no one, not even a small business owner with a disability, was beneath the protection of the state's highest legal office. Media crews began lining up outside the courthouse, hoping for a glimpse of Ramirez or a statement from her spokesperson. The next morning, the hallways were packed. Even Cosgrove, who had relished the thought of Michael being outmatched, seemed nervous. The seat next to Michael was conspicuously empty. He sat quietly, going over his notes, ignoring the stares and hushed conversations around him. Caldwell strode in, the black robes billowing behind him, looking especially testy, as though he too felt the tension. He cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with," he began, grimacing at the crowd. Just then, the heavy door at the back of the courtroom opened. In walked Elizabeth Ramirez, flanked by two associates. Her presence was electric. She seemed to fill the room with an aura of purpose. The hush that fell was unlike the hush of fear. It was a hush of reverence, as though something monumental was about to happen. Ramirez approached the defense table, nodded respectfully to Michael, and then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice strong yet measured, "I am here on behalf of Michael Henderson, at his request and through the authority vested in my office. We would like to proceed with the cross-examination, if the court allows." Caldwell's face turned a shade paler. His eyes darted to the gallery filled with reporters and activists. For a moment, he looked like a king stripped of his illusions of power. The humiliation he had inflicted upon Michael was now mirrored back to him by the mere presence of the Attorney General. What followed was a spectacle. Ramirez dissected Cosgrove's claims with surgical precision, methodically exposing inconsistencies. She presented evidence that Michael's methods were derived from public resources available to anyone. She highlighted how Cosgrove's alleged proprietary processes were, in fact, centuries-old printing techniques. Each piece of evidence was introduced slowly, allowing Michael's interpreter time to ensure he fully understood. It was a stark contrast to Caldwell's earlier impatience. The entire courtroom watched as Ramirez treated Michael with the dignity and respect he had been denied for so long. But there was more. Ramirez had dug deeper than Cosgrove's lawsuit. She had discovered a pattern of decisions in Caldwell's courtroom that disproportionately harmed plaintiffs with disabilities. It seemed Michael's case was part of a broader pattern. Deaf litigants, litigants who use wheelchairs, and those with cognitive disabilities all found themselves at a disadvantage in Caldwell's courtroom. There were records of unapproved dismissals, withheld accommodations, and questionable rulings. If any of these cases were appealed, most plaintiffs lacked the resources or support to continue. The pattern was subtle enough to remain under the radar, but clear enough once you knew where to look. And Ramirez had looked, armed with the investigative power of the Attorney General's office. When she brought this evidence to light, the gallery erupted. Caldwell's gavel slammed again and again as he tried to restore order, but the damage was done. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed at the end of the aisle, and Caldwell's face twisted into a mask of alarm. In a trembling voice, he tried to claim that the evidence was irrelevant to the matter at hand. But Ramirez pressed on, highlighting how Caldwell's bias against people with disabilities could have colored his entire approach to Michael's case. She requested an immediate review of Caldwell's rulings and, in a bold move, demanded that Caldwell recuse himself due to demonstrated bias. It was a legal and moral earthquake. The attorneys for Cosgrove attempted to object, flustered and unprepared for this avalanche of facts. The judge, sweating and visibly shaken, denied any wrongdoing. Nevertheless, Ramirez had laid the foundation for a judicial review that could cost Caldwell his career. The tension in the courtroom soared to near unbearable levels. People sensed that they were witnessing more than a simple lawsuit. They were witnessing history. And at the center of that history stood Michael, silent yet commanding a moral presence far stronger than the judge's gavel could ever project. At lunchtime, the courthouse corridors buzzed with speculation. Activists for disability rights were thrilled, murmuring about a possible long-overdue shift in the legal system. Reporters rushed to file updates for their outlets. Michael, for his part, felt an odd mixture of relief and lingering nerves. This was the fight he had been preparing for his whole life, standing up for his rights, refusing to be belittled, but it was surreal to watch it all unfold so publicly. With sign language interpretation readily provided, he caught bits and pieces of the chatter. He saw the encouraging nods from strangers, felt the supportive pats on his back. Even the building security guard gave him a subtle thumbs up as he passed. It was as if the entire city was finally seeing him, truly seeing him. That afternoon, Judge Caldwell tried to proceed with the trial, ignoring Ramirez's request for recusal. But Ramirez invoked a procedural motion, well within her authority, to suspend all further proceedings until a higher court reviewed Caldwell's biases. This was no ordinary motion. It had the backing of the Attorney General. Caldwell had little choice but to concede. He sputtered some formalities about how he decried these baseless accusations, but the crowd in the courtroom knew his time was running out. Finally, with a grimace and a snarl, he adjourned the court. In the hallway, Michael found himself thronged by reporters asking questions he couldn't hear, cameras clicking incessantly. Ramirez shielded him from the chaos, speaking on his behalf. This case highlights the systemic issues disabled individuals face in our courts. We must uphold the rights of every citizen, regardless of their abilities. That's all for today. The camera lights glared, framing her in a halo of bright intensity. Michael watched her lips move, then turned to his interpreter, who signed Ramirez's words to him. A surge of gratitude welled in him, not only for Ramirez, but also for the countless individuals, friends, advocates, even strangers, who had stood behind him. In the days that followed, the story dominated local media and trended on social platforms. Hashtags like #JusticeForMichael and #NoOneIsAboveTheLaw circulated widely. Disability rights activists organized peaceful demonstrations to demand a fair judiciary. Editorial pieces demanded Caldwell's removal, citing not just Michael's case, but the broader pattern of bias Ramirez had exposed. The entire city, it seemed, was awakening to the notion that equal treatment under the law was not just a slogan but a moral imperative. A new judge, the Honorable Sarah Whitman, was assigned to the case. Whitman had a reputation for impartiality and a history of championing disability rights. She was methodical, calm, and open-minded. During the first hearing over which she presided, Whitman made it clear that Michael's accommodations would not only be met but respected. She insisted that every question, every objection, every nuance be properly interpreted. She allowed ample time for Michael to consult with Ramirez and his interpreter, ensuring that his rights to due process were fully honored. It was a stark contrast to Caldwell's courtroom. The entire atmosphere felt different, less oppressive, more aligned with the ideals that a courtroom should represent. When the trial resumed under Judge Whitman's oversight, Cosgrove's accusations crumbled under the weight of evidence. Ramirez presented expert testimony showing the ancient origins of the printing techniques in question. Several of Michael's clients testified about his authenticity and integrity, describing how Michael had built the business from scratch. One particularly poignant moment came when an elderly artist, tears in her eyes, recounted how Michael had volunteered countless hours helping her reproduce her life's work. "He never once asked for credit," she said through her own trembling voice. "He just wanted to help me share my art with the world." By the end of the trial, there was little doubt about the outcome. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, returning with a unanimous verdict in Michael's favor. Not only was Michael vindicated, but Cosgrove was also found liable for filing a frivolous lawsuit and was ordered to pay substantial damages. The gallery erupted in applause, swiftly hushed by Judge Whitman out of respect for court decorum, but the triumphant atmosphere was undeniable. For Michael, the victory was multifaceted. Yes, he had won the right to continue his business without the burden of false accusations. But more importantly, the entire ordeal had sparked a broader conversation. Never again would a deaf individual, or anyone else with a disability, have to silently endure ridicule from someone entrusted with dispensing justice. The seeds of change were already taking root. Caldwell faced an ethics investigation that could end in his removal from the bench. Disability rights organizations were empowered as never before, using Michael's case as a rallying cry for broader judicial reforms. Outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict, a crowd gathered to celebrate. Michael stood next to Ramirez, who had just given a short speech to the media explaining the significance of the ruling. As reporters bombarded her with follow-up questions, Ramirez turned and placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "Do you want to say anything?" she asked, nodding to the interpreter. Michael hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about the cameras and crowd. But he knew this was a moment that transcended his personal victory. Through his interpreter, he signed, "Thank you all for standing with me. Let this be the day we remember that we must treat each other with respect and compassion, no matter our differences." The reporters fell silent, capturing that quiet, sincere statement. A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the onlookers, some of whom wiped away tears. It was a far cry from the day he first stepped into Caldwell's courtroom, dwarfed by the system's hostility. Now he was recognized as a man of principle, a man whose courage had catalyzed a wave of justice. In the following weeks, Michael's print shop saw an outpouring of support. Orders skyrocketed, not only from locals, but from people around the state who had followed his story. He employed additional staff, including other deaf individuals, determined to give him the supportive work environment he had always craved. Advocate groups began reaching out, inviting him to speak at community centers, schools, and conferences about his journey, about resilience, and about the power of standing up for one's rights, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Meanwhile, Caldwell's situation deteriorated. A thorough investigation revealed that he had a pattern of rulings that undermined the Americans with Disabilities Act. Several of his past decisions were reopened. Former litigants came forward to share harrowing stories of intimidation and unjust outcomes. Faced with mounting evidence, Caldwell resigned, ending his judicial career in disgrace. The State Bar Association considered disciplinary measures, and disability advocates hailed it as a hard-won victory. For Michael, life settled into a new normal, albeit one infused with a deeper sense of purpose. He continued running his print shop with the same artistry and dedication that had earned him the community's admiration. Yet now, each time he heard the door chime announcing a new customer, he smiled with a reminder that he was part of something bigger. He had proven that no matter how small one might feel in the face of adversity, justice, when sought with tenacity and the right allies, could be more powerful than any judge's gavel. He maintained a friendship with Elizabeth Ramirez. Occasionally, she would drop by for a cup of coffee in the bustling cafe next door, offering updates on the ripple effects of his case. She revealed that thanks to the publicity, new legislation aimed at strengthening disability accommodations in state courts was gaining traction. Michael would sign his gratitude, and Ramirez would nod, her eyes reflecting a sense of respect and genuine camaraderie. Reflecting on it all, Michael recognized that he had lived through a transformation, both personal and societal. Though the process had been grueling, he emerged stronger, buoyed by the love and support of so many. He had confronted ignorance and cruelty in one of their most insidious forms, prejudice concealed behind a judge's robe. He had won, not just for himself, but for an entire community that had too often been denied a voice. In the end, Judge Caldwell's attempt to humiliate Michael Henderson became a national lesson. It illuminated how prejudice can exist even in the hallowed halls of justice, and how a single person, armed with truth and the right allies, can topple a pillar of oppression. The day Michael walked out of that courthouse for the last time, victorious and unbowed, he carried with him not just a sense of personal triumph, but the hope that, finally, society might be ready to listen. Justice had been served in the most resounding way possible, through a dramatic confrontation in which the powerful were reminded they are not immune to accountability. The image of Michael standing with the Attorney General by his side was shared across social media, garnering countless comments and shares, inspiring others to stand up for what is right. For many people, the moral of the story was clear. Sometimes, all it takes to spark systemic change is one person brave enough to speak truth to power. And though Michael Henderson could not hear the roar of applause, the message reached him nonetheless, resonating in the universal language of dignity and respect. He had shown the world the power of persistence, empathy, and community. Through a moment designed to belittle him, he inspired an entire wave of reform. And in the end, that wave washed over the legal system, making it a little cleaner, a little more just. His story, one shared quietly in activist circles, went viral, capturing imaginations and stirring hearts. It was a kind of story that reminded us that true justice, though sometimes delayed or obscured, can still shine through, and that when it does, it illuminates every corner of society with a brilliant light of hope.